Thank you, Yannick. I'm actually not from the United States. I'm from Canada, but I know you're from Belgium, so it's all that's fine. I'm really happy to be back in the Netherlands. I realized I've been coming here since 1986. I used to work for the scenario planning department of Shell, and I'll explain when that ended and why, and then worked for many years with Kahane in Netherlands, had lots of adventures all across the country. And I have a daughter who just moved to Almere, so I had the pleasure of spending the weekend there. It was a beautiful weekend on the polder. So I say that not because I'm in any sense an expert in the Netherlands, but in order to express my admiration and warmth for the Netherlands. And I'm pretty sure I've probably addressed several thousand groups, and I've never seen a group with so many flowered clothing before. So this is really, and I love flowers. 100% of the art in my house is of flowers, so I feel really good being here with you. Yeah. I've been working for the last 30 years on collaboration, and so I've had many conversations in the Netherlands about poldering. And the strengths and the limitations of that model. You may not know, but in legal arguments about colonization, there's a Latin phrase, terra nullius, empty land. And it's the legal basis for colonization, certainly is a very important phrase in Canadian history and Australian history. This idea that we come here and there's nobody here, so we can do what we want. And so the way I understand the spatial dimension for a long time in the Netherlands is there's no illusion of terra nullius. It's always been understood there's lots here and we have to work out how we're going to make it work, given that it is not empty land. The illusion which underpinned the colonial project in Canada and Australia, amongst other places, is not present here. So I find this helpful. Also, or at the same time, I had what for me were very meaningful conversations with Julius and Riek, and so I have some sense of the conflicts, of the complex and even painful challenges at this moment in the Netherlands. So the framing I would like to offer for what I'm going to say now is, how can we live together with all that unites and divides us at this particular conjuncture? That's how I think about this work. And the sense I had, without wanting to make it too simplistic, is that the poldering model works less well than it used to, including because of increasing polarization, and beyond polarization, demonization. Somebody suggested I not say that I used to work for Shell 30 years ago, but I didn't see anything useful in concealing my history, but that's the extent that if I was to say that, it might disqualify me. So if that's true about poldering, the riddle I'd like to pose, for which I do not have an answer, is how is it possible to rediscover and to upgrade that practice? And I'm putting it that way because there might be some places where to talk about collaboration would mean something completely new. But I don't think that's the case in the Netherlands. It's more like a poldering 2.0. And the question is, what would that look like? And I think that is a question for you to answer as you engage in this work and as you co-create a new approach. And what I want to offer as input to that conversation, not an answer to the question, but as input to that conversation, is the 30 years of experience I have primarily elsewhere. And so I want to just give you 3 quick examples from South Africa, from Colombia, and Mexico. And I often think that the gift I've been given is to see this kind of work painted in very bright colors. But sometimes people say, oh, yes, well, Adam had this dramatic story from Colombia, but that doesn't really apply to us. That's not how I think about it. The way I think about it is the dynamics are the same everywhere, actually, and to see them in bright colors enables us to understand them when they're painted in more muted colors. So let me offer these 3 stories, and then the way we work in Rios, as Yannick said, we have practice, and theory arises from practice, not preceding practice. So let me tell you these 3 stories and then offer you some more abstract ideas, which I hope can be useful in the work that you're embarking on. When I was at Shell in the late 90s, Shell in Europe was under a lot of criticism. This preceded the current criticism related to energy transition, but from not having divested from South Africa. And it was becoming a really big issue, including for employment in Europe. So you all know the history of the legalized racial segregation in South Africa, the violence that was required to maintain that system, the liberation of Nelson Mandela on February 2nd, 1990. And many things started to happen then, many attempts to find a way forward together. There were hundreds of such attempts. The generic term used for this was forums. And one such forum, which was organized by a historically black university, University of the Western Cape in Cape Town, became known as the Montfleur Scenario Exercise. Montfleur is this beautiful conference center in the mountains outside of Cape Town, and they had the idea of using the Shell scenario method as a way of thinking about the transition from apartheid to democracy. And so they requested technical assistance from Shell, and as I was the youngest and most expendable member of the department, I was dispatched. And they did something that nobody had ever done before in scenarios, in that this was not a group of colleagues from the same organization, in this case the University of the Western Cape, but a microcosm of a large part of the social, political, economic system, including people from all the main political parties. The University of the Western Cape had a close affiliation or connection to the Mandela's African National Congress, but other political parties as well, and business and trade unions and community organizations and academics, men, women, opposition and establishment, left and right. So this was an extraordinary event, at least for me. I had never been in such a room. I was really overwhelmed that it was even possible to have people who had been in violent conflict in the same room together, about about this group. And I'll just tell you one story about it. I've written a lot about this example, but these are three people who are a member of that Montfleur scenario team. The person on the left is Johan Liebenberg from the South African Chamber of Mines. In the apartheid economic system, the mining industry was the arch exemplar of apartheid, because the whole mining system was based on the apartheid system. And the person in the middle, Tito Mboweni, became the first black in the Mandela government, became the first black minister of, first black governor of the Reserve Bank, and then later the Minister of Finance. And when Johan was interviewed some years later, he said, "You went for a long walk after a day's work with Tito Mboweni on a mountain path, and you just talked. Tito was the last sort of person I would have talked to a year before that. Very articulate, very bright. We did not meet blacks like that normally. The only other blacks of that caliber that I had met were the trade unionists sitting opposite me in adversarial roles. This was new for me, especially how open-minded they were. These were not people who simply said, look, this is how it's going to be when we take over one day. They were prepared to say, hey, how could it be?" And the person on the right had been an official of the National Union of Mine Workers, so Johan's opposite member, and he said, in 1987, we took 340,000 workers out on strike, 15 were killed, and more than 300 got terribly injured. And when I say injured, I don't mean little scratches. Johan was the enemy, and here I was sitting with this guy in the room with those bruises were still raw. I think that Montfleur allowed him to see the world from my point of view and allowed me to see the world from his. So this was just a bit of the atmosphere. It was really extraordinary activity. By the end of the exercise, I had really fallen in love with this way of working, which I didn't even know existed, and with this country, which, if you've ever visited, is really very extraordinary in many ways, and this momentous period of history, and also fell in love with the woman who was the organizer of the project. So by the end of the project, I had resigned from Shell and emigrated to Cape Town and married the project organizer. Usual story, you know. And I tell my young colleagues, you can only do this once or twice. The other learning I had from this experience, a bit of a technical point, is that in Shell, we had used scenarios with an adaptive orientation, with the idea that the company has limited influence over what's happening in the world. Maybe they underestimated their influence, but that essentially the scenarios were a tool to adapt as best we could to a situation we couldn't predict or control. Whereas in South Africa, we were using exactly the same methodology, but I understood, but it had a completely different energy to it. And I realized it's because the methodology was the same, but the purpose was fundamentally different. And the reason the South Africans had come together, some from exile, some from underground, some from prison, all of them in some way trying to find a way forward out of this terrible situation, was with a transformative orientation that we have to influence what will happen. And so that idea of using multi-stakeholder dialogue, including using scenarios as a tool, not simply to adapt to the future, but to influence the future. This was really the animating idea, and this was the idea that led to the founding of Rios Partners. After I had been there for a while, there was a young politician from the South American country of Colombia, Juan Manuel Santos, who came to South Africa for a diplomatic meeting and met his hero, Nelson Mandela. It was a big moment in Santos's life. And Mandela advised Santos with respect to the Colombian situation this thing we did, this Montfleur scenario exercise, was really quite useful. Maybe it could be useful to you in Colombia, which at the time was in the midst of they don't call it a civil war, but a civil war between left-wing guerrillas and the right-wing establishment. And after Santos got back to Colombia, he organized a meeting to discuss a possible initiative, and he invited me to come, and I did. And when I got to the meeting room in Bogota, I noticed there was this big disturbance at the back of the room. And I didn't know what was going on, but later I found out that the man on the left, Victor Carranza, was a paramilitary warlord, and the woman on the right, Aida Abella, was a Communist Party city councilor in Bogota. And she was saying to Santos, the organizer of the meeting, this man has tried to have me assassinated 5 times. Surely you don't expect me to sit at the same table as him. And Santos said, it is precisely so that it doesn't happen a 6th time that I invite you to take your seat. So this really was an even more dramatic setting than the South Africa one. And we started an exercise modeled on the South African one, using this, what we now call transformative scenario planning, with a much broader group than had been the case in South Africa, including parties who were still in armed conflict, and government, and youth leaders, and NGO leaders, etc. Had what I think is the only time there have been such, in all of this period, such extended informal dialogue amongst all of these parties, including the FARC and the ELN, the 2 guerrilla groups. Anyhow, if we fast forward 20 years, Juan Manuel Santos was now president of Colombia. He had learned something from that early exercise that he carried with him, and if you have followed it, you'll know that in 2016, with great difficulty, a peace treaty was signed between the government and the largest of the guerrilla movements, and for that, Santos won the Nobel Peace Prize. After 52 years of war and 220,000 people losing their lives and 5 million people internally displaced. And on the day he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, his office put out a press statement about, a biographical statement about Santos, and it contained the sentence that this scenario project was one of the most significant events in the country's search for peace. So I was, of course, thrilled, but I also didn't understand why did Santos even remember these dialogues 20 years before? There had been so many much bigger things that had happened, 5 years of negotiations in Havana. He had been Minister of Defense and had tried to destroy the guerrillas. There had been large U.S. Funds to prosecute the war. Anyhow, lots of things that happened. And so a few months after that, I was in Bogota and I conducted a public interview of Santos, and I asked him this. I said, President Santos, why do you so often refer to Destino Colombia? Because he used to refer to it every month in a speech, and he had a very interesting answer. Actually, unfortunately, my book, Collaborating with the Enemy, had already been published, or I would have included this story in the book. He said, the reason I so often refer to Destino Colombia is that contrary to all of my upbringing, my political, family, cultural upbringing comes from a very political family, I discovered it is possible to work with people you do not agree with and will never agree with. And I found this an extraordinary formulation, because sometimes we think, well, you know, we'll have a meeting, we'll have coffee, you know, we'll have a little drink in the bar, and we'll find it was all a terrible misunderstanding, and actually we agree, we want the same things. But I think Santos was saying something more realistic and therefore more important, that no, we may find that we really don't want the same things, and yet we have to find a way to move forward together. So this idea that agreement is not a prerequisite for collaboration really was impactful for me. And the example he gave, because it's such a clear example, was him and Chavez, the socialist leader of Venezuela. When they met, it was obvious they would never agree. They're from opposite political backgrounds, and yet they were president of neighboring countries. They had to live next to each other. In fact, I'm fascinated by words. In English, the word used often in the peace discourse is coexistence. It's just a frequently used word. But in Spanish, they use a slightly different word, convivencia, living together. And it's the same word used for a couple living together. And those of you who live with a partner, its coexistence is, not really our aspiration. That's a bit of a minimum aspiration. But to say we live together doesn't mean we always agree. It means we're making our lives together with all that unites us and all that divides us. And so I found this image of convivencia really evocative, and that's why I framed it as how can we live together amidst what unites us and divides us in this current conjuncture. Just one more example from Mexico. You might remember that in 2014 there was a massacre in Mexico of 42 student teachers. There have been many massacres in Mexico, but I think maybe this one became so evocative because they were student teachers. I guess anybody can relate to that. And because this image immediately was on all the posters, I suppose because they had everybody's student ID. So it could be visualized what it meant to have this massacre. At the same time, there was a scandal over who had paid to build the president's house, and so there were marches with hundreds of thousands of people. So a really a situation of great social unrest, and again, we tried this same activity on the subject of illegality, insecurity, and inequity. And I just want to quickly show you a set of photographs because I want you to have the image of what this work evokes. This is the first moment of the project. You don't know any of these people, but maybe you can even just looking at the photograph see that these are people who are not used to sitting in a circle together and are uncomfortable not being behind tables. And then the work began. This is a photograph of one of Mexico's wealthiest and most powerful business owners listening to a transgender government official explain how she understands the current situation. And when I look at his face, she's built it with Lego blocks, he's trying to understand why is it that she sees things the way she sees them. And again, with journalists and human rights activists and military personnel, and walking with all of that. And then you start to see that the relationship, even from the photographs, that the relationship amongst people changes as they start to build something together, not each looking at their own notebook, but at the shared product, trying to work out the details. A rebel leader saying to a policeman, the last time I was in a room with a policeman, I was being tortured. The different impact of younger people on the energy of such groups, and then towards the end, a different relationship and a different capacity to work together, and then to present the work formally to the country. So this is just a taste of the practice of the last 30 years that my colleagues and I have been involved in, and trying to do this work of how can we collaborate to address situations that are complex and conflictual and confusing, including among people that don't agree with or like or trust each other. So, what I want to do then, secondly, or the other part of what I want to say, is what we spend a lot of time, 80% of our attention is doing this work, and I've given you 3 stories, but then how can we understand the general principles by looking at these particulars? And so theory arising out of practice. One of the founders of this field, of the field of group work, was an American named, or a German-American named Kurt Lewin. And Lewin is famous for having said, there's nothing as practical as good theory. So I want to offer you 5 pieces of a new theory of collaboration, with the hope that this can be useful to you as you try to develop your way forward. So, yeah. So let me take just 10 minutes for this, and then I'm really interested in your questions. So, quickly then. I think if you're trying to think about collaboration, it's crucial to understand that collaboration isn't the only option we have. We can't collaborate with everybody on everything. It's absurd. So to understand collaboration as contrasted with other options, the world is not the way we want it to be. What can we do? So one option is we could try to make it the way we want it to be, using whatever power, money, votes, authority, arms, to make things the way we want it to be, regardless of what other people want. Maybe we can't make it the way we want it to be, and so option 2 is we adapt. We try to get along as well as we can in a world that we can't change. This is actually what we do most of the time. When I left my hotel this morning in The Hague, it might rain. I brought an umbrella. I can't affect whether it rains. I needed to adapt to the weather. A third option is we can exit. The world is not the way we want it to be. We can't make it the way we want it to be. We don't think we can live with it as it is, so we exit. We quit our job, get a divorce, emigrate, exiting. And collaboration needs to be understood as a 4th option, not the only option. For some people, it's their first option. For some people, it's their last option, but it's one option of 4. And if you do a Google search for images of the word collaboration, you get images like this. Young people in nice shirts, you know, sort of looking happy and enthusiastic. Young man, you know, gesturing like this. Looks very peaceful and pleasant. But I remembered from when I was a child having seen this image. It's a famous image of women in Brittany at the conclusion of World War II who were accused of being collaborators and who had their heads shaven and their clothes torn and were marched through the streets. So this image of collaboration it's the worst thing that can happen to you. It's really dangerous. And I think this tension in the phrase collaborating is intrinsic. On the one hand, we think we need to work with these other people to get where we're trying to go, and on the other hand, we worry that we will be betraying or accused of betraying what's most important to us. So this idea that collaboration is an option, and the question is, what are the conditions that apply in a specific context? So that's the first piece of theory. This is an image of collaboration. We're trying to get somewhere. There's a group of people. It might be complicated to get from where we are to where we want to go. And the recipe that arises from this image is the following. You have to focus on the good of the whole. What's best for the situation as a whole? We have to agree on what the problem is, what the solution is, what the plan is, and then who needs to do what to get from here to there. Does this seem to you like a reasonable recipe? Put up your hand. Put up your hand if you think it's a reasonable recipe. Okay, half of you do, half of you don't. It's not a reasonable recipe. It's not a reasonable recipe, or it's not a recipe that works in contexts of complexity and confusion and conflict. It's not a recipe that works in contexts which is out of control. And so the second piece of the theory is what would be another way of looking at collaboration, and particularly this, what would be the difference between conventional collaboration and radical collaboration? And we talk about this, in fact, in the book that I assume will be given to you. I don't think they were bought just as decoration for the room. It talks about three stretches, from focusing on the good of the whole to embracing conflict and collection, from agreeing on the problem and the solution to feeling our way forward, and from changing what other people are doing to recognizing the way in which each of us are part of the story. So that's a second image. I think actually I'm going to stop there. Yeah. Okay. So then I just want to offer three other pieces. And again, this isn't a recipe, but these are 5 inputs to how you can develop a method, an approach that is more suited than the old poldering to the context you're in. So the three are the third one arises from work we have done last year with the UNFCCC on climate change, and it talks about now specific practices. I'll share all these slides with you. Specific practices for radical collaboration. What would you do, and what should you do, and what should you not do if you're trying to, in this case, collaborate with speed, scale, and justice to accelerate climate action. And what the don'ts have in common is it's a way of working together which is insular, competitive, and rigid, and the approach of the do's is inclusive, cooperative, and responsive. So now we're getting from this general idea of the need to collaborate in the midst of confusion, complexity, and conflict, to specific practices that enable you to do that. The fourth, which we've been using for years and we found very useful, is from Otto Scharmer. This idea that probably the simplest leverage is to change how you talk, and especially to change how you listen. And that this is the most basic thing going on in a collaborative activity, is how do we talk, and especially how do we listen, and that it's not that there's one way is wrong and one way is right, but the way you talk and the way you listen affects in particular, is what we're doing, will what we're doing simply replicate the current reality, or will it contribute to enacting a new reality? And there's a large body of theory and practice around this so-called theory U. And the final piece of this, which has really had a big influence on me, in 2017, I was working in Colombia. This is a man who's very well known in Colombia, and recently named Francisco Durú, was the head of the Jesuits, just finished 5 years as the head of the Commission for Truth, Reconciliation, and Non-Repetition. It's a nice word, eh? Truth, reconciliation, and non-repetition, like not reenacting the past. Anyhow, we were doing a workshop, and in a way, a typical Rios workshop, and he came up to me at the end of the first day, and he says, "Adam, I see what you're doing." And I'm a big admirer of his. I'm seeing him for the first time again on this coming Sunday, and I said, "Well, Pacho, what am I doing?" He said, "You're removing the obstacles to the expression of the mystery." So this idea that the essence of this work is not to get people to do things, which is how many organizers and facilitators think of the work. It's the single most frequent question I get when I lecture on this. How do you get people to do A? How do you get people to do B? This idea that it's not about getting people to do things, but removing the obstacles to the expression of the mystery. I spent hours with him asking him to explain what the mystery is, but to save you the trouble, it's called a mystery because it's a mystery, so I'm no clearer than I was. But I find very practical this idea of removing the obstacle, the expression of the mystery. And then, so the final slide is, I wrote a book inspired by that one sentence about how can we work in a way that removes the obstacles to the expression of power, which is absolutely required to effect change, remove obstacles to the expression of love, to connectedness, and I think increasingly important, removing the obstacles to justice or to reducing unfairness. So this is, in a way, at least for me, what is organizing my thinking. So these are 5 pieces of what I think make up radical collaboration. And all I'll say by way of to conclude is that what I'm trying to convey to you with these examples and with these ideas is that radical collaboration is possible. It's not easy, it's not straightforward, it's not guaranteed, but it can be done. I've seen it tens of times in situations even more dire than the Netherlands. And more than that, it must be done. That it is, at least in my view, the only way we can live together with all that unites us and divides us in the current conjuncture. Thank you.
Well done.
So I think we have about 15 minutes, and I'm really interested in your questions. Maybe a lot of what I said, maybe most of what I said was familiar to you, and so you might be tempted to say, yes, I've always thought this, or this confirms what I thought about that, and that may be true. But maybe what's more interesting for this 15 minutes is to focus on what of all of this is unfamiliar or unclear or doesn't make sense or is very challenging. So maybe just spend a minute with the person next to you. What of what I said is unfamiliar or unclear or really sounds challenging to you? Is that okay? Yeah. So with your neighbor, buzz with your neighbor. Okay. And until
Yeah, so we have until 5.
okay.
But I think
That's fine. That's fine.
Ja, er is gehoord waarvan je dacht. Nou, is.
Wat hij schetst. Schrijven. Uitdaging is bij puzzel zo heb ik voor nummer 1 gezien dat het grootste
Je werkt met boeren.
Ik werk met boeren, maar ik werk ook met gemeentes. Ja. Hij heeft een plan dat hij gaat uitwerken en hij legt het voor en dan zegt hij
Nee hoor.
een lijstje van 10. Ja, 9 punten goed, 1 niet. En dan is dat.
Okay. After the break, there'll be lots more time to chew on this and see how it might apply to your context. But let's hear some of the questions, and probably the questions one person asks maybe also of interest to others. So let me just take 5 questions at a time. So what's a question in your mind? Yeah, please.
I would like to know what was the invitation to the persons who came, because I think that's the first step.
Yeah. Okay, second question. Yeah.
In the polder model, we are trying to find a common ground to find each other. Isn't that what you're also doing in the radical collaboration? So what is the difference there?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, we were discussing whether you should be outside of the group or part of the group when facilitating. And also what helps in that. Would it help to be insider but not to be outside?
Okay.
I wonder if you translate these examples that you gave to the Dutch situation, you will see that in this landscape people already know each other and are used to collaborating, as opposed to the groups that you were helping. And if you look at the topic that we're debating, the big transitions of our time, everything related to climate change, I suppose. Also the complexity and the amount of partners that you have to deal with. Can your kind of system work in that kind of environment?
Okay, and one more. Yeah.
We were wondering how you move people beyond disliking or even worse, hating each other, to move to a place of dialogue. So what is not a recipe? I know there's no recipe, but we're curious about how you've been doing that and what's been so successful.
Okay, so let me just, so directly to try to respond to this. The invitation, the generic invitation is I, the inviter, or convener, think this situation is problematic, and we need to work together in a different way to move forward. And if you also think that, please join me. So my teacher at Shell, Kees van der Heijden, I should say the late Kees van der Heijden, because he passed away last month, taught me that these are problematic situations, not problems. They're situations that different people understand as problematic for different reasons. So the reason I'm saying this is that it's not about, here's the definition of the problem, come if you agree with it and want to work on it, but basically the invitation is, if you think it might be more useful to come and work with others than to stay in your own office, then come and let's see where we can get to. So the starting point is always a sense of frustration, and that if I keep doing what I'm doing just with my friends and colleagues, I will not or may not make progress. Yes, I think the question of what would be different between poldering 1.0 and 2.0 is a good question, and of course the reason I'm offering that word is to recognize that in some contexts this has been proven to be a workable model, but at least one way in which it might be different is, how can we do this with an even greater diversity of perspectives and even greater polarization or demonization, or maybe an even greater number of actors with different understandings and interests. So that, for me, I specifically didn't want to come here and say, you've never done anything like this, listen to these examples. I'm challenging you to what would be the 2.0 which is applicable to the current conjuncture. And of course it will have certain resemblances. These are human processes, but the context, I think, is different than it was before. The outside and inside both have advantages. And so, to make a long story short, what often works well is a partnership between insiders and outsiders. Insiders who understand the context, who have credibility, who have relationships, and outsiders who are not seen as part of the game. I remember in South Africa, this fellow, Howard Gabriels, whose photograph I showed you, said to me at the end of the process, Adam, when we first met you, we couldn't believe anybody could be so ignorant. We were certain you were trying to manipulate us. But then when we realized you actually didn't know anything, that's when we decided to trust you. So I think the partnership between outsiders and insiders can be very... Yes, again, I share these examples because I think they show us these, what I argue are universal dynamics, but in bright colors. And so, yes, people may know each other, although knowing each other actually makes it more difficult in a certain way. Or let me put it another way. If I really have never talked to you and I have these all kinds of stories about you, then meeting you and getting to know you is an instant win. I mean, it's dramatic. You see dramatic things happening. And it's not so easy if I think I know you or maybe even I know you and my father knew your father. And there's a certain normalization of the relationship. I think it makes it more difficult, not easier. But I think the main point is we're dealing with situations of greater complexity, greater dynamic complexity, cause and effect, distributed over space and time, greater social complexity with different understandings or interests or worldviews, and greater generative complexity when we're dealing in some ways with situations that have never existed before. And so what we're trying to find is a way of working together that that is adequate to that complexity. And yes, so I think these war situations are in some respects easier because there really is this, we have to deal with this or we may die tomorrow. And that is helpful in the sense of having people come together. So and then, yes, how to move beyond dialogue. Well, this is really the big question. And I guess the short answer would be, trust is not a precondition. Trust is a result of working together. And the hard part is not simply to meet and to talk, although that may be challenging. The hard part is to act, because it's only in acting that our real interests have to be addressed. So it's actually quite dramatic if you've been working with a group in dialogue for some time and then they start to act together, it suddenly becomes much more difficult. But you're trying to build up gradually. How can we meet? How can we talk? Not necessarily to agree, but at least to understand each other. And then from a basis of a little bit more trust, a little bit more understanding, a little bit more of a shared language, can we begin to act and see where we get to from there. I think we have time for one more round of questions, so another 5.
There was a question here discussed with colleagues. If you agree in the process and you bring it then to the principal, and the principal is not prepared to follow up. So how do you deal with the...
Yeah, so eventually they opt out of the process, so you're collaborating and then...
I understand.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah. We also discussed this, how do you get there, and what really touched me was this picture about the feeling that you can also start to betray maybe yourself or feel like a betrayer in collaboration. And I was wondering how you have dealt with such tensions in processes where those feelings of betrayal were present.
When we invite people, we find that not everybody shows up, but the ones that don't show up, they will talk about the process or even question the process that we are in. How do you deal with that?
How do you work in a collaboration when legislation is forcing you to some points, but you know you have to collaborate with different needs to succeed really in the transition.
Mm-hmm.
We have more or less the same question. It's about democratic legislation.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm already enjoying the evolution from the first to the second set of questions because we're immediately into all the difficult stuff. So, no, but this what I find interesting about what I enjoy about these sessions is I find that people almost always understand what's not straightforward about this. So I appreciate that. Let me group these a little bit because there's some connections and also in the interests of time. So one way of thinking about this is we're going to meet and we're going to make some agreements and we're going to propose this to our bosses. I think that's what you mean by principles, right? That's the way you're using the word principle? Our superiors? No?
Or maybe the representatives of government or the chair.
Okay, so I just, we have been using a different framing, which is, Otto Scharmer once asked me, since when is leadership about recommending what other people ought to do? So I think what we're really looking for is how can a network or an alliance be formed or nurtured that each can act in their own sphere of influence, rather than we've written a report and now it's simply a matter of getting those people to agree to it. I think it comes to the question of democratic legitimacy, which is really important. I remember somebody saying to me in Argentina after the dictatorship, saying, surely we didn't spend all these decades trying to get a democratic government so that decisions could be made in private groups, groups of elites. So I think the connection between dialogue and democratic institutions is important. But this is a well-known idea about between official in the peace world it's called track 1 processes, and informal so-called track 2 processes. And the track 2 processes are to generate ideas and relationships and to try things out. And yes, it would be completely illegitimate to replace the legislature or elected representatives, but there's also things that can't be done in the legislature. In particular, this generation of new options. So I encourage you to think about the connection between these two spheres, and not doing one and not the other. In the peace world, and Michelle is more of an expert in this than I am, but the issue about betrayal is known as the intra-group problem. That we have come to some meeting of minds, but then when I go back to my group, I'm seen as a traitor. So this really needs attention. How can we support people to go back and act in their own sphere of influence? And that's why I insist on this double meaning of the word collaborator. I guess it's the same double meaning in Dutch, as a reminder that there is a tension inherent in this in all polarized contexts. The question of absent people is problematic. And so this question about who needs to be involved for this to be useful, for us to be able to make progress, and is it possible to start with this group and then grow it? So these are the kinds of issues that arise, or if only these people will come, it's not worth doing it, let's do something else. And is there something else we can do so that those people think are uncomfortable enough that they want to join? So all of these practical questions, I use the word terra nullius to refer to empty land, but another way to think about this is these processes are not taking place in a context where nothing else is happening. There's political processes, there's legislative activities, there's other dynamics, there's a history, and so all of the difficult questions, or many of the difficult questions, relate to how can we do our work in recognition of everything else that's going on, rather than pretending that nothing else is happening and now we're just starting. So, good luck.